The second part of this application, basically, because now it's all application. Now we've got the basic ideas. Now we're going to apply them. Is you have to approve the self. It's one thing to hate the enemy and show who the enemy is and denigrate the enemy and make sure that you can kill the enemy without really having to worry about any rules. But then you've got to approve the self. Well, how do you go about approving the self? And typically the way you do that is you show heroic images of the self, especially the self when they're dying. Now, this is in itself tricky. You want to catch people when they're still alive doing heroic things, because it turns out during World War II that what the people at home did not want to see was the bodies of their own dead. So you must not show that, we learned. But you must show people doing heroic acts. For instance, this kind of thing. So on, I can't remember what day this was, but here we are, it's a couple of days after the Twin Towers come down, and here are these three firefighters raising the flag at ground zero. And this was immediately visible and clear as a propaganda image. And I remember it was printed on the back of the Free Press, and I think on the many papers printed on the back of a big page, so that you could, on the back of the main section, so you could tear it off and post it in the window, which is what people did. And without necessarily realizing, they were like, oh, this is such a beautiful picture, and they put this thing up. It gives us hope. It's like, okay, what kind of hope do you want to have? If you're hoping for a war, then this is the right picture to have put up, basically. And it was, for those of us who do this kind of work, I mean, I went into class. I was teaching a first-year media studies class. I went into class, and I held up this page from the back of the Globe and Mail, and I said, what do you think this? What do you think of this? And people were like, well, go USA. Oh man, I was like, okay, all right. It is after all, it was early in term, right? I mean, it was September. Still, we'd done maybe a week and a half's worth of class. I was so enraged. And so I was like, what do you mean, Ma? So I said, look, this is a clear example of propaganda. It's propaganda basically for the people. Then one of my beloved colleagues brought this back for me from the States. She was in the States, and she went to send something. She went to a post office and saw these, and she was like, oh, I gotta get this for Tim. Oh, she knew how to get me to. I was very grateful to her. She came back with it. I was like, oh baby, and I made a scan of it immediately, and I put it up, and I kept this flat. I mean, you don't break this kind of thing up. This is what's known as a first day cover. Where basically you take the flat and you leave it uncut, and you maintain its historical, it's going to be worth money. It was actually worth $9 at the time. It probably is still worth $9. It's probably worth less than, anyway. So, but I was very grateful to her. It was so perfect. And if you go to the States, it used to be in the post offices also often were recruiting centers, so that they would have a whole wall of stuff on the military, on the Army. This is not something Canadians are used to, but in the States, especially in the South, if you go and have a look, next time, it's going to be hard to find a post office. But so I put this up, and I said to my students, what do you make of this? And they were like, well, it's just an image. It's an amazing image. And I said, well, it's an amazing image, all right. I mean, they really knew what they were looking for. They're looking for a flag raising, but this is a clear raising to the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. And people were like, the what, who now? I was like, I will bring in an image, which is fair enough, because basically the target for this piece of propaganda was not people who were at that time, say 17 or 18 years old, although they would become soldiers. The target was their parents, who would remember the images that had come out of the Second World War, even though they themselves had been children, not even during the Second World War, but after the Second World War. And these are the images that I'm talking about here. This is the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. So here we have 6 Marines. I know you can't see them all, but here we have 6 Marines on Iwo Jima, raising the American flag. This is Joe Rosenthal's photograph, one of three photographs. They staged this photograph. The first time he saw it, he was like, click. And then they staged it again and they staged it again. They took film of it, and this became iconic. And so when we saw, let me just put myself between these two images to link them, it's impossible to see this image of the three firefighters and not understand it as a reference to and an allusion to an echo of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. Now, the fight for Iwo Jima, one of the most important islands, basically, that MacArthur and the Marines fought for as they proceeded to Japan, to the home islands of Japan, was not over. There were still, I can't remember, I think there were still like 2 months of brutal fighting that were going to go on. And it was just going to leave Iwo Jima a burned hulk of it was already, these islands are hard to survive on. I mean, basically they're pieces of coral out in the Pacific. However, so you can see the United States, I mean, this photograph is so important. It's probably one of the most important photographs it is one of the most important photographs from this 20th century. And you can see it was made into a 3-cent stamp almost immediately with the Iwo Jima. And then it was made into a 32-cent stamp some years later. Marines raised flag on Iwo Jima and then here's the most recent example. So when I show this to people, it was very interesting what happened. Many students were intrigued. They were like, oh, okay, yeah, now we see what you were talking about. Okay, that's fine. But some of them got really, really mad. They were angry with me because they were like, this isn't propaganda. It's like, okay. Now, remember what Ellul says. The people who are most at risk for propaganda, the people who believe they haven't been propagandized, that their beliefs are their own. And so typically when you see that kind of resistance, it's usually people who are the deepest, truest believers and who are convinced that what they're being shown is the pure unadulterated truth. This was just a picture. Somebody just picked it because it was a good image and it just sort of happened. Ironically that they're in a media studies program. But anyway, this is an appeal to authority. It is also an appeal to force. Now I'm frozen again. It is also an appeal to authority. In this case, the Great Generation, that is the generation which won the Second World War, which is still considered to be, especially by the Bush White House, the people who ran the Bush White House, was considered to be the greatest generation that there was basically on the face of the planet. You know, the people who won, the Americans who won the Second World War, because the Americans won the Second World War. That's all there was to it. The Russians, what did they have to do with it? You know, what was that whole thing with the Nazis, the Germany fighting in Russia for 2 years and having their backs broken? You know, details. Okay, there we go. So here's more of an appeal to authority. Now, this is the death of Osama bin Laden. And again, I would have hoped that the New York Times, I took this from the New York Times, and I would have hoped the New York Times would not use this as a propaganda exercise, but they did allow, what is this, MSNBC? Unfortunately, this was blocked. Let me see if I can make it. It's MSNBC, yeah, as I thought. That was blocked by one of these. Okay, anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, so MSNBC decided to take the last page of the New York Times and print this full color ad, which again, presumably they wanted to have people put up and post in windows and so on. Now, the reality is that by the time we get to 10 years after the event, people were kind of done with Osama. They were like, well, that's kind of finished, you know. There is nothing we can't do when we stand together. Oh, okay, yeah, right. And so people showed up. And as Americans gathered together outside, gather outside the White House after the death of Osama bin Laden. Okay, fine. This is another appeal to authority, but in this case, it's actually appealing to the crowd, and it says the crowd knows what the crowd is doing. That is, the group is not just a mindless mob. It is aware, it's politically invested, and it understands when justice has been done. And so this is sort of um, this is the idea of America that America loves, one of them. Okay. So I thought it was very interesting to see 10 years later, what had become of the firefighters raising the flag. So the next time that somebody's going to raise a flag, can you imagine a picture like this without the American flag? It's like, no, not really. This brought about the movie Zero Dark 30. And Zero Dark 30 is a film which I have to say is one of my least liked films of the last 20 years. Certainly one of the least liked films I've seen about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is supposed to be the, as said here, greatest manhunt in history. Okay. And it got these nominations. I can't remember how many of them it won. But in fact, when the biggest problem for me was Zero Dark 30. Well, okay, let me go through what I put up here. So what I put up is, first of all, this is again one of these problems where Jessica Chastain does play this character who really does exist, and she wouldn't quit on the story. I mean, she worked for the FBI. She would not quit on the chase for Osama. Okay, fine. I mean, they'd already laid waste to 2 countries, so if they were after, okay, go ahead. But the story that the movie tells is basically the sort of long. I mean, she's definitely the hero of the piece. Osama is the villain, but then the FBI are kind of villains too, because all the stupid men who were involved just don't listen to her. Well, that's really normal. I think that's, yes, that's and I can see why Chastain would want this role. It's because here's a woman who's proven right. Fair enough, right? Absolutely, yeah. Men are wrong. They're not listening to a woman who's right. Well, we know that story. That's right. However, the problem is that if you look up the Seymour Hersh article, The Killing of Osama bin Laden, which interestingly enough, the New Yorker would not print, and neither would the New York Times, because they didn't believe it. Didn't believe it or didn't want to believe it. And he talks about this in his book, in his biography, basically, which is recent. But what Hersh comes forward with is this is sort of captured by this headline. Osama bin Laden was an unarmed elderly invalid when Navy SEALs killed him, and Barack Obama lied about the mission report claims. Now, Hersh is an extremely experienced reporter. And what's interesting to you as students of the now Vietnam War is that it was Sy Hersh who was the guy who broke the My Lai story. So who was it who reported on My Lai? Hersh did, the same guy. And he's gone on breaking one important story after another over the course of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So here he is with another story. And it's intriguing that the 2 major news organizations in the United States would not publish it, but he had to go to London, to Britain, to get this published, which I think is very intriguing. Now, people love this film, which ends with the heroic mission. As you can see, the 2 Black Hawk helicopters here about to assault the compound. And they don't actually show bin Laden being killed. They don't actually ever show him because, again, they didn't want to make a hero out of him. Okay. Again, this is a piece of it's the way that you make propaganda, is that you don't allow your enemy to. It's another whole discussion. But the main problem I've got with Zero Dark 30 happens at the beginning of the film, where the FBI and the CIA are shown torturing people and getting usable intelligence. It's like, no, that didn't happen. What we know about torture and the torture programs that were used in Iraq, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that torture does not produce intelligence. It does not produce actionable, viable intelligence. People will say anything to get torture to stop. If you make them feel like they're drowning, which is what waterboarding is, they will say, my mother did it. Yeah, I'll give you the names of here's my bank account number, here's my go kill my daughter, whatever it is, make it stop. Because, so one of the reasons that I am seriously not a fan, I am a deeply unfan of Zero Dark 30, is that Catherine Bull, who made the film, had already made The Hurt Locker, which we're going to look at in a few weeks. And you'll see, it's like, let's have a look at this film, because that's a very useful little piece of propaganda, The Hurt Locker. And it has some very interesting things. And there's not a lot of difference in many ways between the characters of Zero Dark 30, of Jessica Chastain character, and the character of Sergeant James in The Hurt Locker. So this, as far as I'm concerned, is another piece of propaganda. And people looked at it and they were like, well, that's great. It's a terrific, and of course it got nominated by a bunch of Academy Awards. And I'm having a hard time seeing that as being a win for anybody except basically American jingoistic practices, which, we would call colonialism if people didn't hate Osama so much. Jeez. Okay.